How do you cope with adversity? How do you maintain, or at least return to, equanimity? How do you resist succumbing to negativity? How do you recover from harm? How do you integrate, and how do you move forward? Hi, this is Sara Russell. I'm your microdose host with your weekly mood boost and tools for transformation. In this episode, I'll be giving you rituals for resilience. My teacher once told me that I'm not going to ever biohack nirvana. And what she meant by that was no matter how much I studied, no matter how much I trained, no matter what it was that I practiced, all the ideologies and methodologies that I like to collect, this commitment to curiosity that I have, regardless of how much work I put into all of my practices, I was never going to be able to make sure that nothing ever hurt me ever again and that I was never going to feel pain ever again. Being in these messy human bodies out in this complicated world means that sometimes harm is going to happen despite our best efforts to protect ourselves. And so I developed this positive obsession for figuring out how, rather than taking personal responsibility and making sure that nothing bad ever happened to me, because I can't actually control that, right? That's an idealism that we need to kill. Instead, I wanted to develop a practice of resiliency so that I knew when shit went down, which we know it's gonna at some point, that I knew I would be resilient enough to handle it, to recover from it. And I don't want to make systemic oppression an individual problem. So it's not our fault that bad things happen to us, but it is our responsibility to know how to heal from them. So first, I want to make sure that we're defining what resilience is. And I like Dr. Catherine Panter Brick's definition, where she says, resilience is a process to harness resources to sustain well-being. And it's worth noting that resilience kind of has this dual feature, right? Where on the one hand, it can be about never developing symptoms to adversity. And on the other hand, it can be about having those symptoms and bouncing back. So within Dr. Catherine Panter Brick's description of resilience, being able to sustain well-being, I want to be able to hold both. That sometimes it's about never developing the symptoms of adversity to begin with and also being able to bounce back. So all of these practices are going to address both of those pieces of resilience. And resilience can be a trait, as in a quality that we have. Resilience can be a process, that is something that we practice, and it can also be an outcome. We can end up with a sense of resiliency, of feeling resilient, right? And just because we're resilient in one sphere doesn't mean we're necessarily going to be resilient across another sphere. So we may be resilient in the work environment, but we may feel less resilient in our romantic relationships. And so I don't want resilience to become this dualistic thing, like you either are or you aren't, you have it or you don't, recognizing that it may come and go across different contexts and in different moments. So I'm going to pause it, and I got this from my teacher. You are going to survive everything until you don't. And once you don't, once you haven't survived something, none of this is a problem anymore. But until then, recognize that you're going to survive everything that doesn't kill you. And if you're going to survive everything that doesn't kill you, then it's important to develop practices to live a life of well-being and satisfaction and purpose, despite the fact that we are all dealing with a tremendous amount of harm potentially all the time. So there are different ways that we can enhance our resilience. We can do this on an individual level. We can do this at a community level. We can do this on a cultural level. There are all different kinds of ways to enhance resilience. My preferred way of enhancing resilience, these are practices that come from Stacey Haynes and Denise Benson. And they're defining resilience as this ability to bounce back from a traumatic experience. And so in their studies, they came across this woman who was watching children who had witnessed traumatic events. And we know that people who witness traumatic events have the same kind of brain activity as the people who are actually experiencing the trauma. So these weren't people that had experienced the trauma. These were children who had witnessed trauma. But again, we know the brain activity is very similar with this. And they were noticing that there were certain kids that were bouncing back much quicker, much more easily than other kids. And so they started to study them, or this woman started to study them and figure out what was it these people were doing in order to be so resilient. And they came up with 4 different practices. And the first ritual of resilience is having a relationship with animals. And this can be your family pet, right? A dog or a cat or a bunny that you have in your house that you get to cuddle with. Also, if you're taking care of a pet, if you're feeding it, if you're making sure that it's healthy, you're extending all this care, you're in service to something. So this relationship with animals, right? We know like it changes our heart rate when we pet an animal. We experience less anxiety and less depression when we have animals around. But this can also be your relationship with wild animals. So the other day, I bought a blueberry bush. I was very excited about this blueberry bush. I put it on my porch, and immediately this robin showed up and started eating all of the blueberries off of my bush. So like I dangled a little sparkly thing off it because that's supposed to scare the birds away. This robin did not care at all. It actually like perched on top of the sparkly thing in order to eat the blueberry. So I gave it a very beautiful perch to sit on while it was consuming all of my blueberries. I moved it inside the house. It started coming in inside the house to eat the blueberries. And one of my friends said, "It's such a bummer that that robin is eating all of your blueberries." And I said, "Oh, no, that's not my interpretation of it. I have such peace and pleasure and joy in my body that that robin feels so comfortable with me that it feels like it can come into my home. And of course, I'm going to share my blueberries with it." So you can have your relationship with wild animals. You can admire them from afar. You can also have an animal that's your pet sitting in your lap, as long as you have some kind of relationship with animals. The second ritual of resilience is having a relationship with nature. So maybe you like to go and get your feet on the earth. Maybe you like to put your hands in the dirt as you garden. Maybe you love being in a big body of water. How do you connect with nature? Are you a tree hugger? Maybe you should be. Maybe you should just go give it a try. Maybe just go hug a tree today and see if it makes you feel a little bit more resilient. So you get to decide what your connection with nature is to you. Maybe you like to have the sun on your face. Maybe you just enjoy a good rainy day, but being able to feel connected with the wider world around you in some way. And speaking of the wider world around you, number 3 is having a conversation with spirit where spirit answers back. And that last piece is important, where spirit answers back. So again, being connected to something larger than yourself and feeling like you're getting some kind of response from it. So for me, this translates to my ancestor altar, where the ancestors that have passed, especially the ones that I feel particularly close to, I light candles for them, I share my food with them, I present them with flowers, and I talk to them. And my very witchy mother told me that if I'm going to get help from source, if I'm going to get help from my guides and the ancestors, I need to ask them, because we have this idea of free will, right? And this idea that they're not going to help unless we ask for it. They're not going to interfere with our lives. So we actually have to make the request. So I'm making requests all the time. I'm talking to my grandma all the time. "Hey, grandma, by the way." And she answers, I know what you're thinking. It makes total sense, right? That's what you're thinking. I know. But the point is that I still feel a connection to her across time and space. And the psychonauts will get this, right? Like, y'all know time and space, the way we experience them in this super linear way. It's all an illusion. So how are you connecting with source energy? How are you connecting with your guides? How are you connecting with your ancestors in a way that you can receive those messages back? Is it every time a hummingbird shows up? Like people use animal totems and that kind of thing. How are you connecting with source in a way that source actually knows like which number to reach you at? Like which number can source dial and get a hold of you so that you actually pick up and you get that message? The fourth ritual of resilience is having some kind of creative self-expression practice. So I'm a dancer and I feel so resilient when I can find that song and move my body in a way where I'm in flow and I'm being held. And that can be whether or not I'm doing it in a joyous way. I have a whole playlist of rage songs that I can just rage out to. I have a whole playlist of grief songs that I can just grieve to as a way to cultivate my resilience. Maybe you have a musical ability. Maybe you're a visual artist. Whatever your self-expressive practice is, that can be one of your tools for resilience. Now, I said there were going to be 4 rituals for resilience. I actually have a bonus 2 for you because thanks to the work of Judith Herman, who works in trauma and recovery, she actually discovered 2 resilience practices as well. And she was often studying people who had been in severely traumatic experiences, for instance, like a concentration camp. And the fifth ritual of resilience is gift giving. And in Judith Herman's work, one of the things that she was really studying was people in concentration camps who would, for instance, share the very little food that they have. And rather than that sending them into a spiral of scarcity, it actually made them feel more resilient as they shared that. So gift giving can be an act of resilience. And, like if you're thinking like gift giving outside of the context that I just gave, but like on a more like daily mundane level, this idea of gift giving, remember that when you give a gift to somebody, rather than it being about how much money you spent, it's really about this idea of seeing somebody and letting them know that you saw them. Hey, I saw this and I thought of you and it made me want to gift it to you because I know it would brighten your day. That's incredibly generative. And then the sixth ritual for resilience is being of service in the midst of a traumatic experience. So when I think about this, I think of The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk's work around trauma. And he talks about the 9/11 responders who had a fight response, who were able to run into buildings as they were collapsing, as people were trapped inside the buildings. And because they were able to do that, they actually had less PTSD in their bodies. One, because they were able to engage their fight or flight response. In this case, it was a fight response. The people that wanted to move towards were able to move towards people who were in trauma. But also, like within this context of Judith Herman's work, these people are developing a resilience because they're able to be in service to others, that can actually be a way of bouncing back faster. And again, I'm using the language ritual, right? A ritual of resilience. This isn't a one-time practice. This isn't something bad happens to you and you do this practice one time and then you feel all better. But this is really a repetitive practice that you commit to so that you're actually storing all of that resilience, much like a bank account, right? Where you're constantly making deposits of resilience into your system so that if you need to make a big withdrawal, you're not going to overdraw your savings system, right? You're going to have plenty there when you need it because you've had all of these practices. So resilience is, I think of it very much like a tree. And again, this is the Taoist in me. This is from my Qigong practice, where in Qigong, we talk about resilience being this practice of both strength and flexibility. So like a tree, the roots are the strength where they're rooting down into the earth. You're holding solid ground. You know your roots, but then the branches are super flexible. You're able to weather the wind, right? You can move in the breeze. And in order to be able to do that, right, it takes time. The tree grows over so long, developing those roots down, reaching those branches up. And so this is a practice you're going to want to commit to daily over time. Keep nourishing your roots, keep nourishing your limbs so that you have that strength and flexibility when the moment arrives. Now, these resiliency practices, they can feel really good. And because we live in this very puritanical culture with this very puritanical worth ethic, we tend to devote all of our time and energy to the grind and to the grit and trying to get through. And then things that feel good, we put them off as if they're a reward, right? Like all of our life is supposed to be lived in our leisure time, as Nancy Shanto likes to say. And so that means that we end up putting off our resiliency practices because they make us feel so much better, because petting our dog feels good, or sharing my blueberries with the robins feels good, or like getting outside and putting your feet on the earth, with your favorite drink as you turn your face up towards the sun, that feels really good. So then we limit that because of this puritanical work ethic that we have, as if we need to earn those rewards, we need to earn our pleasure rather than prioritizing them. And so my challenge to you, my question to you is, what would it be like if you connected with nature before you went to work? What would it be like if you communicated with source and waited until you got an answer before you checked in with your boss or before you checked in with your coworkers? What would you need in order to prioritize your resiliency rituals? So in order to make this more of a practice, in order to be able to practice prioritizing this, what I'm going to recommend is this 2-2-2 method. So what you're going to do is you're going to commit, if you want, your mission, should you choose to accept it, is figure out in the next 2 days, 2 weeks, and 2 months how you're going to prioritize your resiliency practices. So in the next 2 days, what are you going to do around your resiliency? In the next 2 weeks, what are you going to do in order to prioritize your resiliency? In the next 2 months, how do you want to be embodying and practicing your resiliency practices? We'll end with a poem by Wendell Berry called The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review at Apple Podcasts or anywhere else where you listen. You can also go to trendswithbenefits.com for all of our written work, as well as to sign up for our newsletter. And if you would like me to give you some support with your relationships, please send me a voice memo to podcast@mudwtr.com describing what it is you're struggling with, what it is you're curious about, and I would love to give you some free coaching on air. So go ahead and drop me a voice memo. You can use the voice memo app on your phone. I would love to hear from you. I would love to offer you some help. May you find your peace. May you find your presence.